Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht er was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Rum, links, 2, 3, rum, links, 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich in die Arbeit einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Drum links 2, 3, drum links 2, 3, wo dein Platz genossen ist, weil ich in die Arbeiter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Prolet ein Prolet ist, drum wird ihn kein anderer befreien. Es kann die Befreiung der Arbeiter nur das Werk der Arbeiter sein.
Drum links 2, 3, drum links 2, 3, und ein Platz genossen ist, weil ich in die Arbeiter einmeinst und weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Здравствуйте, comrades. Welcome to, well, an early and impromptu edition of Socialism Saturday, I guess. So listen, we are doing our official, real Socialism Saturday starting at 6 p.m. That is what was on the schedule. That is what I had planned for. I was not planning on going live right now. You guys didn't know I was going live right now. This was a completely impromptu affair because I discovered, well, I guess I discovered it last week and then I just didn't look at a calendar. But I realized, I suppose, that our good friends over at Red May were going live at 4 p.m. And I have to say, based on the number, this could be Red May's most popular presentation yet, because they have like 30 people waiting, which in the land of Red May, that's actually quite a few people waiting for their live stream. And this is a presentation from Red May that I wanted to watch anyway. It's called Values, Judgments, Normativity, and Communist Practical Reason. And so I was sitting here going, I could spend the next couple hours working, which was the original plan, and then we do Socialism Saturday at 6, fine. Or why don't we just go for it, commit fully, and do an extra long socialism marathon? Because Red May's presentations typically end up taking about an hour and a half. Maybe some. It's not going to take any more than 2 hours because we are doing Socialism Saturday at 6 p.m. I'm going to will it to not take any more than 2 hours because I do have a plan for the 6 p.m. stream. But I thought, you know what? They're live. I can go live. We can all be live together. We only get, Red May only comes around once a year. And so why not just go for it? And hopefully their chat will be popping today. Hopefully they've got a lot of stuff going on. So that's what we're doing, guys. We are doing Socialism Live. And apparently this woman, Cordelia, I don't know who any of these people are, really. I mean, I know some of the socialist staples that we watch on the channel for Socialism Saturday. I've never heard of this Cordelia person. So, but apparently she's popular, well-known, communist. So it will be interesting to hear her thoughts on values judgments, normativity, and communist practice. And I wish I could tell you what this presentation was about, but I can't because Red May has provided me with no description. Maybe they have a description on their website. Let's check real quick. Guys, please mount that like button while we are waiting. Oh, now they've turned on slow in their chats. I want to be really clear, guys. I don't want people being disruptive in their chat. Red May is really getting aggravated with us, partially because we're asking really good questions in their chats when we stream their presentations. But Autumn, you and I need to have a chat because we have discovered, Autumn, that you are a moderator on Sam Cedar's channel. We and don't think we've forgotten about that, the fact that you lied about us last week on Midwestern Marks either, Autumn. So we need to have a chat. We saw some of the things that you were chatting in on Sam Cedar's channel last night on Nitwits. We have discovered that you're a mod over there, which means, kind of makes me feel like Sam Cedar's a socialist. If I'm honest about it, why else would you be a mod on his channel, Autumn? And we're still going to have a discussion about the fact that you went and lied to people in Midwestern Marks chat about the fact that you said we were going to raid their channel, and we were not raiding their channel at all. So we had a good relationship, Autumn. You can now no longer be trusted. You're welcome to hang out, but we are now going to go with the base assumption that everything that you are saying to us is a lie. No, you lied about us. You lied about me and my community, purposefully trying to disrupt something that we were not disrupting. Like your true socialist self, Autumn, you lied. We were very nice to you. We had very polite, cordial conversations. And then you not only threw me under the bus when I allowed you to be in my chat and have whatever conversations you want, you also threw everyone in this community under the bus when you lied about all of them. So you owe everyone here an apology, Autumn. I'm sorry. That's just, no one forced you to come over here. No one forced you to engage with us. And no one certainly forced you to go onto other channels and lie about us. It's rude. It's inconsiderate. It's unnecessary. And we don't appreciate it. I feel like I'm having to channel my fucking inner mother right now, and I didn't even want to be a mother in real life. So I don't know why I'm fucking mothering people on the fucking internet, but this is the world in which we live, I suppose. Anyway, guys, we're waiting for Red May to get started in about 5 minutes. I want to be very, very clear. I do not mind if you go over and ask good questions of Red May that are relevant to the discussion. I don't want to see any shit posting from my audience in their chat. We're better than that. We watch these people all the time. We know how these people think. I want you, if you're going to go over there and engage in their chat, to be polite, to be cordial, to be considerate, to follow their rules, to ask questions that are good, thoughtful questions based on the content of the conversation. And I think there's a way that you can ask really smart and thoughtful questions that will hopefully disrupt the thought process a little bit, but that are actually smart and thoughtful questions relevant to the conversation. I fully expect that if you are coming from my audience and you're going over there, you're going to represent well and you're not going to act like them. Okay? Because every single time that we act like they would, every single time they use it against us. And then they start reing and blocking people and it becomes completely unproductive exercise. Okay? So be better. That's all I'm asking. Be better. Well, maybe Autumn, it was Red May, but I have you on video either way, lying about me and lying about my audience, and I don't appreciate it. Yep, Autumn thought she was never going to get busted. Autumn thought I was never going to catch her on other channels talking shit about us. I'm not sure that Sam Cedar is a social democrat. I mean, Sam Cedar's really boring now, to be really honest. I was very disappointed on him. Can you tell Sam that I used to watch Sam Cedar every day religiously back when I was a Democrat, like 20 years ago when he was on like Air America? I watched him every day religiously. I even watched him after he got fired by Air America because I loved Sam Cedar that much. I was really disappointed with what I saw last night. He has no energy. He has no enthusiasm. He has no excitement. If you're a mod on his channel, can you let him know that like he really needs to like step it up a notch or two because he is nowhere near his former glory right now. And it was deeply disappointing to me to watch someone that I spent so much time watching 20 years ago to like just fall like that and be completely just like boring and not even have anything interesting to say. I don't know. You can maybe pass on the message. He really is. It was bad. It was bad. It was so bad we had to stop watching it and started watching Tim Pool instead. That's how bad it was. Sam Cedar drove us to watching Tim Pool, Autumn. Oh, good. Red May says we plan to start about 5 minutes after to give people sufficient time to trickle in. That means they're running late, which is good because I have some other stuff to do. All right, guys. So we're gonna start watching Red May as soon as they get started. Again, I want to emphasize: do not be disruptive in their chat. I don't want that happening from my community. I want everyone here to be better than that. Ask good, thoughtful questions. That's all I'm asking. In the meantime, I just want to remind everyone that we will be getting started with our official and real Socialism Saturday, starting at 6 p.m. Autumn, as I said, I watched Sam for years. I watched him for I was probably watching Sam Cedar back when you didn't even know who Sam Cedar was. Okay? It is not the same. He has lost his edge. He has lost whatever made me like him before. He's not even funny anymore. It was really sad. Anyway, at 6 p.m., we are going to do our official Socialism Saturday, and I'm actually very excited about this because on Socialism Saturday today, we are taking a 3-part class on how to be the very best comrade that we can be. I actually asked my husband earlier because my husband, as you know, is from Ukraine, but grew up in the Russian speaking part of Ukraine. So his family is like ethnically Russian. And I asked my husband and I was like, Victor, do you have some tips on how to be the very best comrade we can be? Because he was at one point in his life a comrade, literally. And he said, "Don't do it, Carlin. Don't do it." And I said, "That's not helpful, Victor." But we will be seeking advice from the socialists later today, and they are going to explain to us how to engage in comradeship and allyship, and it's going to be pretty great, and I'm really looking forward to it. And that is going to get started at 6 p.m. This is a class that is set up from an organization called Liberation News. Shout out to Qbert in my community for finding this. I'm really appreciative of it. So we will be doing that at 6 p.m. and that's going to be pretty great. Other things I want you to know, please make sure you are subscribed to my Substack, which is Carlin, KARLYN.substack.com. I don't know why my window doesn't keep changing. There it goes. This is where you're going to find all of the latest news and unwoke content that I have, to include evidence that they are indeed teaching anti-racist math in elementary schools, specifically in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to include evidence that Black Lives Matter is specifically fundraising to put critical race theory in the classroom. Well, I guess you're just gonna have to hang out and gain people's trust back, Autumn, because I don't right now, I don't believe that you were not the person that we saw lying about us on either Midwestern Marks or Red May. We can go back and review the footage. We're just not gonna do it right now. But I'm not blocking you. I'm just saying that the trust is not there right now. That's all I'm saying. You can pass along the message to Sam Cedar that he needs to fucking amp it up a notch or two. That might be really helpful. I don't know. I have nothing else on that right now. But please make sure you are subscribed to my Substack. And then, of course, over on my Unwoke Art merch store, which is at unwokeart.com, you can get cool swag, to include the official Socialism Saturday Join the Cult t-shirt, also to include the new Be Bourgeois design, which is our direct middle finger to the socialists who want us to be the proletariat. I don't want to be the proletariat. I would want to be bourgeois. I want to have money. I want to have power. I want to own private property. Being bourgeois is mostly about the private property stuff. in the land of the socialist. And so I'm a big fan of private property myself. And so I've been embracing the bee bourgeois mindset with the dapper fox here with his absinthe glass of beer. You can find all of that over on unwokeart.com. And by the way, you can also still get, for a limited time only, the golden Trump mug, just because I'm feeling a little saucy. All right. All right. Yes, I really would like you to pass. Listen, Autumn, nothing would make me happier than for Sam Cedar to not suck, okay? Like I said, I listened to Sam almost every day for years. For years. He needs to up his game. It was sad. It was sad and it was pathetic, and I expected more. All right, we are still waiting for Red May to get started. And by the way, guys, we do have Red May tomorrow is also doing a stream. So I think we're going to do a little Sunday special stream. Hang on, I'll show you. We'll click back into this, don't worry. But Red May tomorrow is also doing another stream that I do want to cover called Marxism and the Oppression of Women at 40. They're getting started about 2 p.m. tomorrow, which means we'll get started about 15 minutes before. And that'll be great. I'm not being mean. It was sad, Autumn. It was really sad. I quite literally had nothing to react to. You can go watch the stream I did last night. Sam gave me nothing to react to. He was even talking about Trump, Autumn. He was talking about the Trump CNN town hall, and he gave me nothing. And it was deeply disappointing. Deeply, deeply, deeply disappointing. Like, if Sam Cedar can't have a good and positive and enthusiastic reaction to the epic return of Trump and the CNN town hall, I mean, come on. That's Autumn. That's a softball, Autumn. That is a lobbed pitch. That is something that is given to the left as a gift, that is meant to be something that you guys can knock out of the park any day. This is like what you've trained for years. You have complained about Trump for years and years and years, and then you're presented with something like the CNN town hall, and you are so flat and unenthusiastic about talking about it that you give me nothing to react to. Deeply disappointing. Deeply. Deeply. I mean, I kind of thought the same, Ninja Artist. I thought that Sam Cedar would be very excited. All right, guys, if you've just joined, we are waiting for our early edition of Red May to get started. Just found out you became a free agent today. Well, I hope that's okay, Nick. I hope that's all right. As a reminder, do not be disruptive in their chat if you're going to go over there, or you can just hang out over here and we can watch what they're talking about. This is apparently going to be a really well-attended presentation from Red May, so congratulations to them for that. I don't know who this Cordelia woman is, but Autumn, do you know about this Cordelia woman? Can you explain who this person is? That might be helpful. But we're going to hear what she has to say about value judgments, normativity, and communist practical reason. I don't even know what communist practical reason means. Hopefully we actually get a succinct definition tonight. That would be pretty great. See, even someone in the chat is saying capitalism isn't so bad after all. Who knows? Maybe we'll even find common ground with the socialist. Who knows? Who knows? Oh, getting started. Oh, everyone shh. Oh, we can hear their sound, so that's good.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 7th version of Red May, your 1-month vacation from capitalism. We've got a great weekend starting now. I want to clue you in first on tomorrow's event, which we are actually overjoyed with. It's called Lisa Vogel's Marxism and the Oppression of Women.
We're looking forward to tomorrow's event, Philip.
40. It's 40 years since that book by Lisa Vogel, that kind of paradigm-changing book, Marxism and the Oppression of Women, was
Philip
published.
And I have basically matching
we have a great
hats
panel
today.
to discuss
I feel like we're simpatico.
the book. Kirsten Monroe, Cinzia
really.
Arruzza, Paula Varela, Melda Yaman, and Sue Ferguson, and I think possibly a surprise appearance. So
Ooh, a
do watch that
surprise
tomorrow.
appearance.
It's
Maybe
at
Sophie
1
will be
p.m.
there.
But
Wouldn't that be nice?
today, we have another exciting event. We have Cordelia Belton back. I think she's been part of the last two Red Mays. Cordelia, as I hope you know, was one of the founders and hosts of the much beloved podcast, Real Abstractions. And she's put together a topic today that I find fascinating simply from the title, Values, Judgments, Normativity,
I find it
and
fascinating
Communist
too,
Practical
Philip.
Reason. I love the play on words of value, judgment. Normativity I take to be the antagonist, traditional ethics, and communist practical reason is, of course, the one that entices. Is it like Aristotle's phronesis, or are we looking at something that's a Kantian term?
That is a
Are we
really
going to
great
have
question,
noumena
Philip.
and phenomena divided here, or is Cordelia going to ground this somewhere else, or perhaps not ground it at all? The questions bristle
we
in
never
the air,
expect
and
the
I wait
socialists
to
are gonna
hear them
ground things, if
addressed.
I'm honest about
Cordelia
it.
has brought some of her comrades with her who I'd love to meet, so I will turn it over to Cordelia Belton. Welcome back to Red May.
Thank you, Philip. That was a wonderful introduction. I certainly want to see that panel on women.
Is Cordelia trans?
Yeah, I don't know. I think
Does Cordelia have an
should be
Adam's
like
apple?
a play-by-play radio announcer. That was really something. So there
I'm
are
not
a
trying to be
couple,
mean, I'm honestly asking.
couple folks, people who asked in the Zoom chat who are welcome to sort of pipe in with comments, questions, little rebuttals, requests for clarification, or what have you, as we go along. But I will open it up for questions at the end. I've given, as I mentioned, I think on Twitter, I've now given this talk twice before, so I'm especially excited to get some feedback and to maybe walk through it in a little bit of a slower and looser fashion than I did the first couple times. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about how it came to be. And for that, I have to thank Will Roberts, wonderful guy. Sorry he couldn't make it today, but he has already seen this and served as a very, very capable workshop organizer and discussant. So I probably wouldn't have subjected him to it a second time in full anyway. In a nutshell, I was off to Montreal to give a paper at a different conference on some really, really dry, like metaphysics of social kinds type stuff. And Will was like, hey, if you're here, maybe we should get together and do a little workshop for the department people at McGill. And I had an incredible time.
This is live. This is why we're going early right now. We're
productive.
still doing something else.
I took up some material from the book project, sort of jammed together 2.5 chapters, one of which is in an article form forthcoming somewhere else, other one of which is still
Reagan. This was
under
impromptu.
review. And I was like, well, maybe I can put this together
yours.
into a package. We can pre-distribute it, and we'll get some good responses from the folks at McGill. And so I absolutely did. And because I already had this to hand, the very gracious Red May organizers said, you know, shame we weren't there. Would you want to run this back for us in Seattle, or digital Seattle, which I guess is the permanent location of this conference? And so I was like, absolutely, sounds like a lot of fun. So I'll warn you before we get into the thick of it that this is some of the edges here are a little bit rough. Be appropriate,
Steve. Don't fuck around. No shit posting.
On reasonably short notice for a sort of rough cut workshop. And so I would encourage you all, if you ever feel like, you know, polemicizing against or taking up or circulating, citing anything in this.
No, we're doing something else later, Bob. This is
give me a holler, and maybe I can send you some more finished stuff if you like. But other than that, it should be a lot of fun circulating with you all. And as I said, I'm really excited for the feedback comments, questions, rebuttals, and so on. It goes pretty briskly, and probably there will be things that we don't get very much time for. So feel free to ask questions, ask me to expand on whatever. All right, so I'm going to read a sort of abridged version of this, maybe stop and explain a couple of the thornier passages or give background. It was written for an audience of political theorists primarily and philosophers, which explains that unwieldy, almost grotesque title that Philip was having such a fun time with. And so there are parts that are a little inside baseball. And then also it's not written presuming that you're a Marx person. So I might jump over the more remedial Marx sections, and probably there are some Marx claims in here that y'all will have fun with, but Marx, not really written for Marx people, not really the big point. So with that preface, I'll take it away. So as I said, this workshop paper was written for a workshop convened by Will Roberts at McGill University, and I want to thank him again, not only for having suggested
McGill
this,
University is so
really
woke,
accomplished
like really
scholarship,
bad. They're in
which
Canada.
has served as a consistent source of inspiration as I've attempted to hack away on what may well seem from the outside like a rather idiosyncratic set of problems. And of course, I'd like to thank you all for having taken the time to be here today. And I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and questions. So this, as I said, in his attempt to add and break de novo a pretty unwieldy book project into a core set of arguments, hopefully discussable and debatable before a mixed audience. And so again, I apologize for any rough edges, marginal remarks. Most of the material herein has been presented only separately, and the argumentative cartilage bringing these arguments together is what at times sort of gets left out of this picture a little bit. And so for these reasons, I've erred on the side of rendering these arguments a bit less technical and perhaps more didactic than strictly necessary. And I've left out a lot of the discussion of the literature, save Will Roberts' work. And so his work is going to be our anchor here as we get into it, because he convened the workshop. And I figure if we're going to pick one reference point to situate ourselves in the literature, it should be his really exceptional work. So a few decades after it seemed near moribund amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union, Anglophone reception of Marx's work has certainly reached a new high watermark. The work of the past several decades has particularly benefited from the belated English language uptake of German language Marx reception. And I have in here particularly the work of Backhaus, Lohnfeld, Brentel, Heinrich, Krau, Mao, Postona, and Reichelt, which alongside the work of English post-Althusserians, the 70s rediscovery of early Soviet theorists Rubin and Pachipanis, and the sort of long chain descendants of the Marxist humanist tradition, have been taken collectively to embody a tradition of Marx reading referred to generically as value form theory. So the value form school, taking its name from an appendix to Capital entitled The Value Form, can be loosely distinguished from other traditions of Anglophone Marx interpretation by its focus on value as a social relation and what generalized commodity production, qua generalized form of production for value, might have to say to treatment of social relations in general. And so more to the point, we might distinguish it by a comparative disinterest in the topics through which Marx was strip-mined by the post-war Anglophone interpreters, whom, even where they read Marx normatively, viewed to these very
this is like even
distributional
more
arguments,
word salad than normal.
as was in the cases of Romer, Wolff, Prisworthy, Wolff, Skintis, Wright.
If anyone has any ideas what this person is actually talking about, please let me know in the chat, because this is like some of the most word salad that I've heard in a long time from a socialist. And so we all need to come together and help each other understand this, all right? This is the purpose of socialism, is to understand what these people think, and I have no effing clue right now.
Taking thoroughgoing markets as an incontestable necessity is, of course, by the same stroke, a demonstration of why these distributional concerns can't be those of Marx. Instead, this tradition held, to begin, that generalized commodity production is characterized by a few ostensibly mutually necessary conditions, those being wage labor, production for value, and so on, and concerned itself with what might be said analytically from these conditions alone.
Normativity just means what is within the norm, what is considered normal.
Compelling account of how, barring concerns of distribution and stability, generalized commodity production is necessarily worthy of supersession by communism. And this is for the simple reason that these concerns are directly downstream of what it means to mediate social decisions by way of money and markets, rather than some unjust distribution of
they do
initial
not
endowments,
realize this.
sedimented inequality, and so on.
They do not.
So, where this value form tradition might read Marx in the service of something like political theory, it sidesteps these complaints of fairness, inequality, and so on. As these issues are, like liberal political theorists will inform you, addressable within capitalism, with, for instance, like transfer and distribution branches and Rawls, they can't be the normative issues which would motivate Marx and readers of Capital to a thoroughgoing communism. And after Roberts, we might say to the same effect that a reading of Capital Volume 1, as what he calls a political speech act, allows us to claim that much of what Marx understood himself to be doing was asserting the irreducibility of certain features from that picture, namely money and wage labor, to which his contemporaries often assign blame, which had the effect of serving as a powerful critique of reformisms and rival contemporary utopian socialisms. You know the drill. It isn't one bad feature which must go, it's the whole arrangement. You can't discard one of these features without discarding the whole lot. And you can think here of something like Marx's arguments on the fair wage. So, although this is a fairly simplifying revisionary history, it'll serve for our purposes here. Here, all I wish to do is to underscore that the schools of Marx reception, which I'm reading together here, read Marx as providing in Capital analysis of what's wrong with the rule of capital. And these schools describe specifically what's wrong as social domination, impersonal domination, abstract social domination, although what they mean by this varies from a very generic use of domination in the sense of Herrschaft to more specific uses of domination by Skinner, Pettit, Lovett, and others, working in the tradition, for instance, of Anglo-American neo-republicanism. I think there might be important similarities between these domination complaints, especially the more generic kinds, and complaints of alienation and ratification made by these readers' forebears, although I don't have space to make this clear. So Marx himself does not use domination in a particularly technical sense. And correspondingly, most of the work in this literature doesn't attempt to show the correspondence of the phenomenon they read off generalized commodity production as domination to any particular conception of domination in the literature. And I follow Roberts in finding this vagueness a little bit problematic. So the formal side of this argument is of dubious value without a delineated concept of domination. And the political theoretic side doesn't really get off the ground should the reader lack agreement on the morally weighty nature of the conception of domination which is to be employed, and agreement that there exists a competing course of action. Here, communism would, lessen the phenomenon cited. And so, Roberts addresses exactly this problem in Marx's Inferno, attempting to specifically embed a reading of Capital somewhere in the lineage of the value form in Pettit's concept of domination. And we obtain at the end of Roberts's analysis the dictum that the content of socialism is seen to be the universalization of Republican freedom. And
the content of socialism is the universalization of Republican freedom. No,
work more or less in this vein,
that's not correct.
Addressing the same ambiguity to be Soren Mao's excellent Neat Compulsion. However, in spite of the very real accomplishments of Roberts' project, I want to argue that there remain two interesting lacunae here on which to work. And the first is in part a stylistic one. Roberts accomplishes an admirable reading of Capital, but I believe there remains some work to be done in the task of addressing these arguments at the level of
can you look up who this Cordelia woman is and let us know?
And Roberts says quite cleanly that
she's obviously like
the
a professor or
mechanisms by which
teacher
a
somewhere.
competitive market affects the decision-making of everyone who enters it to sell their products constitutes domination insofar as they expose all those who enter the market to uncertainty, which is akin to something like Pettit's claim that of the particular psychologistic harms of being subject to the arbitrarium of another. And it renders all a slave to the decisions of others, insofar as preferences of others impose themselves without any need to justify themselves and without any possibility of being contested. And that there is a quote from Will Roberts. And so I'd like to experiment in making an argument much along those lines, along the lines of something like a sort of atomic commodity relationships harms, or those of the aforementioned Neue Marxist scholars, but with fairly minimal reference to the specific conceptual apparatus of capital. And I believe this argument is at least partially separable from the remainder of the project. And I hope by the separation, we're able to both address it to the broader political theoretic tradition, so as to say to those, domination theorists, and there are a lot of these guys, non-Marxian or quasi-Marxian domination theorists debating whether capitalist domination is better ameliorated by a universal basic income or a job guarantee. And the outcome they seek is only realized by the abolition of wage labor. Should we encounter disagreement, recapitulating the argument from last will make clearer on which specific properties of markets, money, domination, and so on we disagree. And I'll add as an addendum here that I think separating out something like an argument with political theoretic ramifications from something like the theory as a whole, the work as a whole, actually has the benefit of improving the way in which historically, critically, we're able to read the work as a whole. I hope that it both helps out those in allied political theoretic disciplines and makes reading Marx a little bit less weighty, something that we can really take all of our best historical chops.
Nothing. They don't want to replace it with anything.
I'll admit as well, although I'm not going to elaborate here, that while I'm agreed on the sort of profound, base wrongness of capitalist social arrangements, I'm not altogether convinced by the core normative arguments of the neo-Republican project. Domination as a distinct harm from interference, non-domination as an intrinsic or primary good, and so on. But this work of explicitly exposing the interface between the descriptive and normative components here, while constructing the descriptive so as to provide us with something at the end of the day that we might later find normatively salient, allows the same descriptive arguments to be addressable to different normative foundations. What I mean by that here is if we move in the direction of something like
we love
saying
the
in reading
stuff.
Capital non-normatively, we say Marx finds this to be a problem, but he's not interested in articulating in a prima facie moral fashion why this is a problem. We can still have an argument that shows downstream of, for instance, the commodity considered abstractly and the things necessary for it to be conceptually coherent, we obtain something like a set of rules,
I think we've already
covering
watched
laws, and so on, which will lead us down the road to say that if we find this, and that to be profoundly wrong, profoundly bad, which is not something we have to argue to make this sort of analytical claim. Just we can have this analytical claim and we can address it to your gut intuitions, to my feeling of injustice or what have you, right? And I'm not concerned to argue that Marx really wants to recapitulate this thick sketch along these lines here. So the second lacuna is a little bit of a subtler one, and its validity as a concern, I think, remains to be demonstrated over the course of the paper. It is the lack of demonstration of the existence of any possible institutional arrangement which would satisfy something like the above complaint, which would best generalize commodity production according to the normative grounds on which we find the above complaint salient, while meeting a set of pre-existing desiderata, for instance, with regard to the provision of certain needs. And if you're a sort of mainstream political theorist here, you can talk about primary goods, Pareto improvement, and so on.
This is live. I can't control what they're saying. I can't control the fact that this person doesn't make any sense. I can't control the fact that this person has a really shitty microphone that's making it hard for me to understand them. But what I will say is I'm really kind of like clinging on to the Q&A section of this presentation at this point, because I think that the Q&A section is where they typically say the quiet part out loud and where we're probably going to get the most information. Carlin, as a you're a socialist, Steve. Okay, I get it now. As a libertarian who supports freedom, are you against the conservative idea of the traditional family, i.e., I'm not for or against any type of family that any people want to have. I think how you formulate your family is your business. It is none of mine. I am not for any type of family. I'm not against any type of family. It ain't none of my business, bro. That's how I feel about it.
Supposed to somehow manage a Pareto optimal means of coordinating production and schematically marketize social action. And the analogy to Hegelian reconciliation here is something like what Hegel means when he talks about the actual and the rational. It's through appreciating the conditions of our dependence, the limits of our freedom, that we actually come to appreciate how we are free. So many would opine axiomatically we can't do better, and domination theorists would have us only minimize domination rather than entirely nullify it. And so there's a pretty extensive literature, and I'm adding this as a sidebar here. If you go out and look of people who talk about domination and socialism, domination in the workplace, domination of markets, it's been a hot thing in philosophy for a second. Most of these guys, effectively none of these guys, are actually content to make this a point about markets and money in general. They talk about dependence on the boss. They talk about dependence on the wage. You get a lot of stuff that's sort of analogous to mute compulsion. But their basic concerns are they're interested in remedying this through making possible something like exit from this arrangement, reducing your dependence on this arrangement by offering you a universal basic income, worker managed firms, and so on, right? And we don't think that this is going to be satisfactory if we're on board with the project of Capital Volume 1. So anyway,
Capital what?
Is the result of this process of market mediation in fact arbitrary, non-rule governed? And this is supposed to be what makes power over someone arbitrary and thus domination rather than just power. Is it characterized by deliberative isolation? Is the exercise of market power unfettered by the input of those thereby affected? And ultimately, were the social technology of the market to dominate us, would this be sufficient?
Autumn, this is provably wrong because a lot of conservative women work outside the house. So that's not true.
The same kinds of social decisions that ultimately
it was an impromptu decision, Julie.
Whatever normative standard we want to claim here. And so this is all to say. We're looking for an argument that proceeds analytically from certain logically necessary features of generalized commodity production upon which we can agree, and furnishes the basis for a critique of commodity production, wherein this property is not only shown to be necessary of commodity production, but also shown to be obviated by some other scheme of institutional arrangements. And I'm going to sidebar here. The crucial difference between this and something like recipes for the cookshops of the future is that here we're not filling in determinate content of what one ought to do. We're merely attempting to render this claim salient.
Autumn is trying to win back our trust after she lied about us to either Red May or
right?
Midwest.
It's like an existence proof.
We're giving her a chance.
It's not a prescription. These are fundamentally somewhat different thoughts.
Fuck no, Trump is not a libertarian.
Anyway,
no,
this
he's not.
Sort of contrarian project would ipso facto mount agreement against capitalism, which even the most egalitarian-minded social democrat or whomever you talk to would concede renders their ideal theoretic institutional arrangements unsatisfactory. And so the simple question that motivates this sort of inquiry here is, if we Marxologists have this argument to have,
Marxologists?
Why don't liberal political theorists? Why don't everyone else? Why aren't they aware of this kind of atomic harm, which is always and necessarily present in generalized commodity
conservatives don't care if women have male friends, except for Mike Pence, and Mike Pence is the exception because he's nuts.
Marxists working on the 20th century revival of neo-Ricardian economics often referred with whatever accuracy to what they called the fundamental Marxian theorem. A theorem
this isn't true either, Stevie. There are conservative Christian nationalists who want that.
Which served as a kind of basis for mounting distributional arguments against mainstream marginal economics, as well as a kind of check.
Libertarians want no government.
Fidelity to Marx of any particular formalism of economic activity in terms of production function matrices. And so, well, this particular theorem, basically picking out something like the accounting identity, that positive profits require positive surplus labor, has little to do with our purposes here.
Exactly.
In another sense, we're after something kind of meta-argumentatively similar. we're looking for a reading of Marx that furnishes a theorem, preferably an epistemically lightweight one, which demonstrates that generalized commodity production necessarily and in every case entails some normatively salient consequences. And so this theorem is going to look something like our two-part desideratum above, a lemma analytically proving something of generalized commodity production and opening up into a normative complaint. Apropos of the extensive debate in political theory on Marx and morality, we can observe this sidesteps the grounds of the debate. And Holden, as did alone in the players among that big 70s Marx and morality debate, who saw me, that Marx found something normatively objectionable about capitalism, as follows from his having labored to overturn it, and yet also that the argument of capital, or at least one of the arguments made therein, is not an explicitly normative project. We're free to show it entails from some concepts of classical political economy and to leave the particular normative embedding of this lemma to the reader. As may be plausibly argued, Marx had a substantive normative complaint, but arguing on normative
No, they want everything to be privatized. That's not the same thing.
For Marx, the specific normative salience of the features of capitalism he describes are, once the description is accounted for, completely obvious. Marx doesn't think you need to explain why to find this concrete capitalist social phenomenon abhorrent. It just is for him. So, at the stage of reconstructing this theorem from Marx, we'll seek to arrive at a conclusion which would be normatively salient for our interlocutors, those who aren't yet on board, without arguing for the normative grounding itself. The first question is, what resources do we have in capital to mount such a proof? Capital famously begins with a commodity, and here we're going to commence from a minimal, fairly revisionary sketch of an abstracted commodity, as well as several of the properties we believe to be required for its conceptual coherence. I'm going to jump over some of the more granular parts of this treatment so we can get to the more interesting stuff. I'm going to talk about value specifically. Famously, Marx's stipulation of the commodity has value. I think the way we ought to treat a commodity having value here is effectively, I'm just going to start by treating it as a kind of predicate. X has value. Value, which Marx states, and here people might find some of the finer details of this argument contentious. Value, which is necessarily measurable in money terms, is equivalent to the socially necessary labor time required to produce the commodity at hand. Socially necessary labor time itself not being expressible in temporal units before the mediation by money in the market of heterogeneous labors and production processes.
Autumn, there are all sorts of...
I don't mean temporally.
She's not saying anything I understand anyway, so I feel comfortable muting her. Autumn, there are all sorts of things that are done in society that are not driven by profit. ESG is not driven by profit. Companies would make far more profit if they discarded all this ESG bullshit, all this woke bullshit, but they're not doing that. They are embracing it of their own free will, voluntarily, because they are being forced to by the fucking authoritarian overlords. It is not a profit-driven motive. You guys assume things are driven by profit, or their motives are driven by profit when they are not.
You need no non-convexities and so on. But to say that this ratio of two values is the ratio at which two particular commodities are to exchange under these conditions is also to pick out the respective shares of the aggregate social products, which production of each commodity represents.
And honestly, it's a reflection of the fact that most socialists have never had a real job and they don't actually understand how decisions are made in organizations, that they make the assumption that everything is about achieving the most possible profit. That is retarded. I'm sorry, that's not how it works.
Expressible in dollar terms, which we may hold to be an objective property of the commodity.
It maybe should be how it works, but it's not how it works.
This is not at this point to specify any sort of relationship between subjective valuation and value, right? So value is unlike most of the other predicables with which we're acquainted because of its spectrality. Value, although being an objective property, is not itself an object swirling itself away.
You're purposefully twisting my words,
You know, the
Autumn.
true
This is not how you
proposition
build
P that those
trust
cars
after
worth
you betrayed us
$10,000
and lied about
could become
us.
false so that any property of the
No
car
fucking
observable through
socialist
such
tricks,
process and change
Autumn.
it. So were, for instance, a technological process of car manufacture to drastically change and render new cars with this model of car in your cost list, the value of the car would obviously change. A particular specimen of a commodity, right, which might validly be said to be extraordinarily valuable, like a photolithography machine used to make advanced semiconductors, would shed the entirety of its value were it transported back to like King Arthur's court, right? I want to say, and this is a pretty cheeky footnote here, but I'll leave it in anyway. Along these lines, I really would contend debates about where value is created expose themselves as pretty fundamentally meaningless. It's not an object, it's a property. And it's a little bit akin to talking about where something like the redness of roses is created. Through what place and process apart from the creation of roses, and the process, whether you want to talk about that in terms of social conferral, sense perception, you know, we can be like naive color realists if we want, which lead roses to be red at all. So nevertheless, we may say in this account that value remains objective rather than subjective, simply because the value of a particular commodity is obviously subject independent. To recapitulate, what it means to say the value of a particular commodity is such and such is precisely to say that under certain formal conditions, the good is exchangeable for this amount. Under these conditions, the ratios of their values dictates ipso facto the ratios at which all other commodities would be exchangeable. And so it's actually this set of facts about a commodity's relative exchangeability under these certain formal conditions, which is what would make true any particular proposition about a commodity's value. And so it might seem particular that a property of an object about which we're concerned is the fact of its relative exchangeability under certain conditions, by no means guaranteed to be satisfied, right? It sounds a little bit akin to that Searlean formulation of social constitution.
It's the worst word salad we've heard in several weeks. It really is.
But instead of telling us what this object counts as in the actual context, we're instead talking about what it would count as in a context which we may not well have seen, and which we're not even guaranteed to see.
And they're winning.
Commodity X would
These
count
people
as,
are winning.
Y1 linen, Y2 tires, and so on in these conditions. And there are plenty, though, of latent conditional properties to be had. And, you know, by means of a requisite number of latent conditional properties, we could polish off the question of emergence once and for all, right? I could just specify, I can specify the behavior of any object under any conditions by just stipulating as a property the fact of its behavior, the fact of what it counts as in this, and that hypothetical condition. So what could be the significance of this conditional property in particular? And the answer has to do with the nature of these conditions. Conditions C, the conditions at which where all goods would exchange their values and have value key prices, which again is not supposed to be, is not supposed to represent any sort of actual condition, represent the conditions of optimal reproduction of the social surplus. We could say in these sort of neo-Ricardian terms, we could say more or less they represent the conditions of equilibrium. And I'm noting here that I'm reading together something like equilibrium.
Exactly.
Something like optimal reproduction.
They bore us into not paying attention.
And something like a more formal general equilibrium here. And there are salient differences. I actually think the most salient difference for our purposes is actually the treatment of the theory of the firm, as well as completeness of markets, and maybe the handling of cases of joint reproduction. So, you know, a little bit of a sidebar, but famously in general equilibrium, we have a sort of issue with theory of firms stemming from the fact that firms, there's no profit to be had, whereas you don't really have a satisfactory solution to cases of joint reproduction in either the sort of neo-Marxian or neo-Ricardian formulation of this. But schematically, the difference between these cases is not going to be important. This is basically just to say the set of prices where commodities would have prices corresponding to their values would be the set of prices which would maximize the reproduction of value. And the ramifications of this point become sharper when we turn to a discussion of practical reason. So practically speaking, when we engage in social action to do with commodities, we're engaged in buying or selling. From a set of price commodities, we choose to buy or not buy, and out of quantities, we set prices and production levels for the commodities we produce. In everyday life as proletarians, the commodities we choose to buy or not buy are principally consumer goods, and the commodities we choose to price set and choose to sell or not sell are units of labor power. For firms, we also need to think of the purchase of intermediary goods, we have more laxity in price setting, and so on. This social action to do with commodities might sound prescribed when it's described so deeply, but it's really not, right? The costs and payoffs of most social actions are downstream of the prices of commodities. So our decisions to work or not work classically fall under this schema, and to something like your bourgeois economist, we weigh the utility of our wages against the variable levels of disutility we get from various sorts of work and pick an optimal job to perform and so on, right? This holds for our means of obtaining subsistence as a matter of course.
This is a whole
More to the
vagina
point,
monologue,
most of the
but
choices
not
we face in most domains
remotely
of
as
life are
entertaining.
choices we must weigh, at least in part on the grounds of costs and payoffs downstream of the mediation of money and the market. And our decisions to buy and sell at given prices aren't as arbitrary as all that. So when we're deciding to buy and sell at particular price points, we have nominal freedom.
This
Should I
isn't
find
true,
myself in the
Autumn.
position of running a
This is
car factory
provably
and
not
I declare
true.
my cars to sell for vastly less than their value, I won't just be
Whatever
like,
human
I'll go
beings
bankrupt.
need or assess that they need
Should I,
is
as a
what will lead
consumer,
to
decide that
profit.
I'll pay, 50 cents per gallon for gasoline? I can post a request for proposal in the fashion of a government contractor, but I'm not very likely to get any bids. And I'm not going to have a lot of luck levying this offer in person to nearby gas stations. And so as a producer, I might have some leeway to deviate from the level at which my commodities would exchange in condition C, but my rope isn't really all that long. And failures to adapt as values change with technological changes to production processes and so on, ultimately culminate in proletarianization in the long run. And so I'm going to henceforth refer to the decision to buy or sell at value, at ratios, prices, which the given commodities would exchange at in condition C, as the market rational decision.
I can't control that, Amazon Eve. This is live.
I'm stipulating
I didn't know what you was gonna
market
say.
rationality here. This might sound a little bit awkward to the more Marxy audience. I got a little pushback from a couple of the political
Don't
theorists
be a fucking
to whom
retard,
this was
bro.
originally presented.
At least try to say
Because
something
it was
smart.
the question
Come
is,
on.
are you taking up an existing sketch of market rationality? I'm stipulating it in a formal way, and a little bit of the formal machinery is concealed here, specifically in the hopes that you see the phrase market rationality thrown around. You don't really have a good formal sketch of what it means to fill in the content. So again, catchy phrase for stipulation here. So more formally, market rationality will consist of the choice of what we will refer to as the value optimal option from a set of options characterized by a value payoff.
Listen, if you guys can sit through this, and maybe we can get a golden nugget or two once they get to the Q&A, but I'm telling you, if you can sit through this presentation, then you can go sit through an actual socialist conference in real life, just like I did a couple weeks ago. This is our training ground to sit through boring bullshit, to be able to know how to manage the situation so that when the time comes and we actually need to interact with these people, we can do it without losing our shit. So consider this like a day at the gym. Consider it leg day. No one likes leg day at the gym. This is what this is.
And in the long run, continued losses will exhaust the stock of money required to purchase new commodities in order to begin the next instance of the production process and so on. Without this money, the agent loses the ability to buy, and as such the ability to produce, and as such the ability to sell. And so they have no choices at all from the standpoint of market rationality, because no activity in which they can engage at this point will be productive of value. So to recapitulate, where a particular decision consists of the choice to buy or sell a commodity at a particular price, we're in the long run compelled to do so at a particular price level. That price level is the market rational level, and is the level which represents the greatest self-expansion of value. And not only is this result wide sweeping in terms of the set of social decisions to which it's to apply, it actively furnishes the basis of a challenge to critics of marketization, right? It seems like the maximal expansion of value, the maximal expansion of social surplus here, the fullest development of the productive forces, however you prefer to put it, it seems like we couldn't possibly pose better trade-offs than those the social technology the market has given us. And so to recenter domination for a second in the picture, it's certainly the case that there's a form of power being exercised over a choice set. The payoffs of the choices on which we're to decide are not only affected, but almost wholesale constituted by value. And we're taking value here to be a generic for the entirety of the system of money markets and so on, schematically in that bit right there. But the satisfaction of the other conditions which we take as necessary for sort of power to be domination, and thus sort of automatically morally appear quite a bit more ambiguous. Domination is not only power over choices, but power that in various conceptions is subject only to the arbitrary will of the dominator in the sense of not being rule governed, fails to track the interests of the dominated, or is discursively isolated, whose exercise does not involve those dominated. And so the power we want to say that value as such exercises over choices is rule governed
because
in a
you
fairly
clicked on it, bro.
sense.
That's how it works.
It ostensibly succeeds with flying colors at tracking interests, and is actually supposed to do so with Pareto optimality, and is infinitely sensitive to perturbations of demand/supply at the behest of those who would be dominated. So we're in sort of an awkward place here, attempting to make the strong case for this as domination in the formal sense in which people take up the concept. Granted, it's not immediately clear that the judgments made by value as to how one ought to act in particular social situations, those which in practice exclude other choices, are practically contestable at the level of the individual, but in a certain light, social democracy in the Polanyian sense amounts to a mechanism for such contestation. And so I'll note also that non-contestation is neither necessary nor sufficient for a form of power to be domination in the literature, although Pettit suggests contestation as a practical means of reducing domination in many cases. Value makes certain judgments that may dictate the trade-offs within some set of choices. Upon occasion, we believe these judgments may err. Where these judgments err, the democratic polity votes on some remedy. Perhaps a subsidy or sin tax is needed. Perhaps this sphere of social life
very rarely
entirely.
Do they have black people. Every once in a while they do, though. Every once in a while.
And so these are the cases in which the extant literature in the philosophy of markets trades.
Yes,
we sort the truly incommensurable cases from the commensurable enough ones, and we sniff cases until we arrive at the truly repugnant. Not a lot has changed between Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. We find ourselves alternating between the hat we put on when we go to the market as a bearer of a particular commodity and the hat we wear when we're going to vote on referenda, sort of tempering the market around the edges. While domination ensuing from capitalism is certainly not off the table, and the fault may lie with the formal nature of the conceptions of domination present in the neo-Republican literature, we're having some trouble at this stage of the argument establishing that this sort of market mediation is in every instance, or even really any instance, domination.
A nice summary.
The motivation
Capital
for this is likely
domination is basically her premise.
To render certain types of interfering choice weight modification non-problematic. Pettit, after classical Republicans, repeats ad nauseum that good laws don't reduce, but rather increase.
Great question, Akshay.
My mediating what you can and can't do is not ipso facto supposed to reduce the scope of your freedom and pose a problem, so long as I'm doing so in certain ways we think are going to be just, non-problematic, and so on, right? We're always interfering with each other's lives. And so this is supposed to be the basis of what allows us to specify that domination is different from just acting and thus interfering in general. And so in the same sense, market mediation here starts to look pretty dangerously close to something like a kind of inoffensive state policy. In contrast, more concrete dilemmas within the workplace, wherein the means of subsistence are at risk.
That's funny.
That ensue from the marketization of society, appear better candidates for neo-Republican domination. What Mao calls the sort of mute compulsion, obliging one to work, quite possibly under morally objectionable conditions.
Oh no, Anita hand job is over in the Red May chat. Let's see how long this lasts.
Republican theorists from the liberal Lovett to the more self-consciously neoliberal Taylor are for this reason basically always content to recommend some level of universal basic income above subsistence, so as to create the choice of exit, not only from any particular relation of
Can someone
employment, but
ask if
even
there's
from
going to be a
employment
discussion in
simpliciter.
Q&A? That would be
And
pretty
again,
great.
this more concrete case
I
of
need a
domination
discussion
is
in
the fourth
Q&A,
candidate for
like
increase.
now.
Because it's not only addressable by social democratic reform, this is a reform actively being proposed, right, by liberal and neoliberal self-identified reformists. And so I suggest for a second, momentarily suspending our interest in immediately identifying value mediation as such with domination of this section. We're going to get back to it later in the argument. Our second line of attack is going to be through the second rationale given in Roberts' work for the unacceptability of domination itself, insofar as it's an aside from the identification of this mediation with the thick concept of domination. The identification with domination itself, insofar as domination is to be an intrinsic bad, supplying the whole of the critique to this effect. That is, and this is what Roberts says, that individuals cannot get together.
This is
and talk about
precisely what it
sorts
is,
of
Adam.
things
This
that
is why
should
it's
be and
necessary
what
for us
should
to
not be
listen to
done,
it, to learn
and
their
what sort of
language.
reasons should and should not count as good reasons. This is to say, individuals wish they could collectively form judgments on what trade-offs are to be made in various sorts of social decisions, and they're unable to do so because the market makes them for them, ignoring in this span of argument the aforementioned existence of democratic institutions, those that I called Polanyian a second ago, sort of adjusting along the edges. My judgment of what's rational here is different from the market's judgment in a way that's normatively salient. The question is where, if market rationality so effectively maximizes consumer surplus, the production of the things we want and need with respect to the varying degrees with which we want and need them, as well as the relative difficulty of producing them, where would these cases occur? In the economic literature, the canonical exceptions to the optimality of values judgment are called market failures, and they're treated as essentially exceptional cases. In the classic treatment, that of Wolff, they're taxonomized along 4 lines, those being public goods and externalities, increasing returns / non-convexities more broadly, incomplete markets, and distributional inequality. And so to briefly recap those for y'all, the first one is where the decision to buy or sell a commodity at a given price, in fact, may have an effect on someone not party to the contract of buying or selling. The second kind, increasing returns, non-convexities, is irrelevant for our purposes, although I mentioned it as a problem for these sort of formal, like linear algebraic formulations of Marx. The third, incomplete markets, is the fairly demanding condition of completeness of markets, not only for producible goods, but for ever increasingly ornate contracts upon these goods, futures markets, options markets, and so on. And the fourth is distributional inequality is self-explanatory. But none of these, which is interesting, none of these 4 sort of canonical cases of market failure have faced particularly extensive treatment in the Marxian literature as ways in which generalized commodity production is supposed to do ill, to fail. Instead, you hear quite a lot about the ostensible antinomy between production for use / production for need and production for value / production for profit. You hear about the sense in which generalized commodity production doesn't abet human flourishing, and we hear about how the free association of communism brings about full and free development. Is there a connection between these approaches, or are our objections not addressable from the terrain of judging desired outcomes? So this is going to be a pretty tendentious bit. Effectively, what I'm going to attempt to do here to try to provide a little additional clarification, because it moves pretty quickly and I got a couple questions, is show if you take up this Marxian reading in a particular light, you wind up with a couple cases of market failures, which ultimately lead you to completely find against the suitability of markets in any and all cases. And I think there's going to be a funny way in which these 3 sets of market failures, which I'm going to propose, which are principally some of them are subsumable under the former taxonomy. One of them's novel. I think together, they're going to kind of recapitulate in a sort of fun way a lot of the complaints with generalized commodity production at the level of logical necessity, at the terrain of the ideal average, which we find sort of
great call.
problematic.
I didn't hear that.
We find to pose a real sort of like hitch for us in finding ourselves okay with the mediation of money and markets generically. So I'm going to argue here for three subcategories of market failures which haven't been treated in the public choice literature before, but which together I claim apply to all social action mediated by value. And so I believe, considered together,
mediated by value,
that these three subcategories of market failure capture what it means to be for there a divergence between production for need and production for value, as well as what it means to say that generalized commodity production stunts full and free development, in that these three subcategories of market failure are assimilable to the language of mainstream political theory, economics, and so on, but not ultimately soluble.
Autumn, have you actually been to Cuba and visited those farms and asked them how they're doing? Because I know people who have. Go to Havana and ask the waiters in the restaurants in Havana if they're allowed to eat in the restaurants.
Production for use, production for need. I'm not making the strong claim that this is the principal maxim with which Marx is concerned. Certainly his focus on it is pretty marginal. We never really get a full sketch of it from him. We don't even really get a particularly full sketch of need or use, or need, use, utility. The latter two of which he uses basically interchangeably in the pretty limited deployment of them in the first volume. So I think to the extent that you can attribute something like this position to Marx, the sort of taking need seriously position, it's going to be a little bit of reading Marx against Marx. So the first of these three subcategories is the simplest. It's that of a heretofore unmentioned variety.
Akshayan with the great question.
So while there's been extensive discussion on the subject of free time under capitalism, and so, while of course we're not living in the world of Keynes's rhapsodic predictions, working time has declined fairly consistently in the core economies over the past century. And there's also been extensive discussion of the viability.
Hang on. Autumn, I think it's bullshit that American tourists aren't allowed to go and spend money. I'm not in favor of that. What I am saying is that if you go to Havana and you ask the waiters in the restaurants if they are able to eat in the restaurants that they are working in, they are going to tell you no. Because A, they can't afford it. B, the restaurants in Havana were just built for the tourists as show. And then I want you to go and actually talk to the farmers in rural Cuba and just ask them how it's going with the redistributed farmland that has been granted to them. Ask them how that's all going for them.
Might be like the sort of truck.
It was impromptu, Kurt. I went early. I went early for the live.
I would want to unwind with something like this every now and then. But effectively, the sort of classical framing of decisions to take particular jobs is in terms of the relationship between the utility from income against the disutility from work. But not all jobs are alike, of course. It's somewhat of a commonplace that meaningfully different work conditions would render work no longer an object of disutility, but perhaps eventually something like lifespan. But there's no reason for labor markets to feature not only the market for the predominant way of performing a job, but also a vast set of alternate labor processes for similar tasks, ranging around the means, perhaps archaic or less hyper-specialized of performing this task, the number of hours, requiring employers to eat the cost of training the future communist dilettante and so on. Rather, transaction costs and bargaining, as well as the poor availability of capital to the folks approaching the bank with a proposal for a business wherein they would produce something in a way other than that which is market rational, renders the set of markets not only incomplete, but it asks people to perform these sort of single life-consuming jobs in conditions which not only could be made better, but may well previously have been so. And next, we're going to wind up with another Marxian complaint recapitulated in this schema here as a case of non-substitutability. This is the case of demand for goods and services, wherein a property of the good or service is that it's not exchanged for money. And this might sound trivial, but it's actually surprisingly broad. A prospective patient of a therapist might well harbor
We're really
desire
not
for
sure,
something
Andrew,
like
if I'm honest about it.
psychological care, but divorced from
I'm just
commodity
praying for a
relations.
Q&A pretty soon.
Paying therapists,
All I want right now is a
produces
Q&A.
pressure against any kind of behavior that might cause offense. It forces the therapist into this role of debt collector, to put on that character mask. It creates a feeling of not being meaningfully cared for. Yet, there definitionally can't be a market for a commodity that's not exchanged for money. It's a contradiction in terms. So this is a case of a market that should exist, or at least, something like your mainstream liberal economist would think that it should, but it can't, doesn't. And so this good is also, at the same time, going to be a case of a good underproduced, a good that would have something like, quote, end quote, positive externalities. And of course, the reason is, effectively what this means formally is just that something like the socially best level of production of this good would be significantly higher than the level that we have. So in the case of something like therapy, it's not technically going to be a public good because it's excludable.
No, I
private
cannot
goods.
because this is live. I'm
Strictly
sorry.
speaking, there aren't really
We're all
externalities
lost.
at
You
all.
just got to go with it,
Insofar as
bro.
there
Come back at
definitionally
6.
can't be a
6, we're going to do actual socialism Saturday, but this is live
what
right
it
now,
means
so
to
no, I
be for
cannot
good to
pause
be the
it and
sort
sum
of
it up.
good that's not produced by the market is that there are no market incentives to produce it. And as there's meaningful desire
I appreciate the super chat, bro, but
provision
come
of
back
this
at
is
6, it'll be a
something
lot better.
systematically necessarily is not going to happen under generalized commodity production. So we straddle here two of these sort of classic categories in political theory, the public choice literature, bringing together something like a market failures case and an externalities. It's the intersection between market failures on the grounds of incompleteness and market failures on the grounds of externalities.
We're all lost.
And so finally,
we're gleaning nuggets here and
we
there.
get back to the
That's not all we
classic
can do.
case of
I'm
market
sorry.
failures
This
on the grounds
is
of
the reality of
externalities.
socialism.
And this is going to be a concept that you hear people attribute to Perdue, although in fact the word was never uttered by him. A paradigmatic example, of course, would be something like pollution, right? I've bought a coal plant and I can choose to produce electricity by means of coal generation as I wish. It's profitable for me because the price of coal is very low, and yet I'm severely adversely affecting both the physical health of my immediate neighbors and the long-term well-being of all those on the planet. As it stands, I'm in fact unable to take into account the interests of these groups without being outcompeted. Doing so in the schema we gave earlier would not be market rational. And this is the market failure as there's uncaptured loss to consumers, individuals, being inflicted in each purchase of a new unit of coal power, for which, we would want something like the way we mediate social action to take into account, and yet we can't.
Did they?
It is impossible for the
They got rid of my
producer to take this into
question.
account. If you take this into account, you will go
Literally,
bust.
all I asked was if there was going to be a discussion and a
The only
Q&A.
outcomes in which we come to some positive arrangement would be classically where the government is supposed to impose a Pecunian tax to capture the true social cost of pollution. Or, in the Coasian sense, where citizens claim these as of yet unimagined property rights to clean air, and they attempt to derive some variety of arrangement by which they'll auction them off to me. There's this fantasy. This is like one of the classic.
Okay, they didn't block me. They just got rid of my question about is there going to be a Q&A.
Right? These guys try to show formally that if you give me a sufficiently well-specified set of property rights, somehow we all negotiate to ensure that I have the title to X units of breathing good air and not dying.
They did not block me.
We can all arrive at the sort of internalized market clearing price if in fact those property rights are specified. Obviously, those property rights aren't specified. They can't be specified. They're the cases in which it doesn't even make sense to specify them, barring sort of political economic conditions here, would be cases where transaction costs make this impossible. But anyway, there's nothing novel about this case here, right? The externalities case. It's just a simple provocation. The provocation is something like this. When you guys, and here, this is effectively addressing liberals, liberal political theorists, economists, all the people who are concerned with something like a better, more just social world, but not something like the abolition of markets. When we talk about production for need or production for use, do we mean anything other than production according to what would best satisfy the needs and wants of all, as contrasted to the market rational levels of production as anticipated by value?
Who decides?
However this might
Who
be
decides
formally
what everyone
stipulated,
needs?
are you actually confident that it would differ from what it would mean to fully and properly
And do I
internalize
need
all of
yarn
these
in the
cases?
revolution? I would say
Along
I
these
need yarn
lines,
in
the
the
distinction
revolution.
between
Others
this
might consider
argument
that a
and the sort of
luxury. So who
classic
decides?
argument is not principally the level of grounding. It's really a distinction of willingness to generalize this argument thoroughly. The communist, in hearing of production for use or production for need, finds these sort of social communal deficiencies in production as measured against these standards, and even the most ostensibly unobjectionable market action. It confronts market society effectively with a simple question. Is there such a thing as a social action that only affects two parties, the parties on either side of the contract? Why shouldn't we consider, we have all of these other cases of irrational discounting, imperfect information. What social impact aren't we considering when we have cases that run the gamut from the cost of pollution case to something like large cars on the street, large cars carrying these increased risks of injuring people, unsustainable agricultural methods which deplete the soil, which hasten antibiotic resistance. When we hold as the object
So we're not
of
going to be
inquiry
allowed to have
something like
large cars
a
under the
realization
revolution
of human need,
because
of the
they've
good for
decided that people don't need
we
big
find
cars.
axiomatically means in which our lives might be bettered behind every social position. And so taking this position seriously, which is something which is basically absent from the literature, implies bringing about what would realize full and free development or human flourishing, insofar as these contribute to something like well-being, the good for people. This position effectively just amounts to a discrepancy between the judgments we would make on the grounds of human welfare and those the market would make. If the market indeed, for these reasons, structurally fails to judge in the interests of need, use, the good for people, we've answered the demand for a proof of the preferability of a different scheme for judging. And so, in summary, I've attempted to formally embed a version of a Marxian critique of generalized commodity production at the level of the ideal average in terms that I think are assimilable to liberal economic discourse, analytic political theory, and so on. And so I'll add as an addendum here, right? I got a great question.
Look, they're arguing for me to be canceled in the
someone in the
chat.
audience,
He's spreading
the first time
lies
this
again.
talk
Autumn,
happened
your
at
friends are
McGill.
spreading lies
And the
again.
question ran something like this. All right, but effectively, doesn't this mean that you're hoping, that this argument be taken up by something like the liberal, the social democrat? I think the specific question was, doesn't this boil down to something that I could sell, like,
does she
I
have
could
an
give
Adam's
to
apple?
someone
I mean, for
not
real, is this
in
person trans?
on the full Marxist project, that I could give to a relative? I think that
I
someone
really
said,
feel like
that I could find at an airport bookstore.
Not that it matters.
And
People are allowed to be
my
trans.
response there
I'm just
was,
saying.
well, first of all, you should sell the book for me. But second of all, if in fact this argument in full is sufficient to get the liberal and the social democrat to come along on something like the categorical insufficiency, the categorical failure
that means she's
of
a queer
markets
Marxist
to mediate
too.
social decisions, even at the most sort of basic, ostensibly inoffensive case. So if liberals and social democrats are coming along with me on that, no markets, no money, I'm already pretty happy with the contours of the conversation. I'm pretty happy with what this intervention is effectively supposed to do. I think we're going to have a significantly better discussion if our interlocutors are content to say, yeah, you know, we're not going to be judging according to markets. So we've obtained a set of schematic ways in which markets by the commonplace account fail. They structurally fail to produce the sorts of work which would be necessary to live fully realized lives. They necessarily and logically fail to produce appropriate levels of the kind of good which we demand in an intrinsically non-market
Thank you, Andrew.
form. And this concept that you hear sometimes, externalities, lacks a convincing
This
reason
sounds
why it
about
ought
right.
not be generalized to social action in general. Given all social actions
Great summary.
have not done effects on
Appreciate
parties
it.
not captured in either side. Our next question is, can we find accounts of institutional arrangements which would meaningfully address these complaints? So this section gets fairly meaningfully abridged due to space, but as it
I
stands,
can't
we're
help
just
but
going to
notice that
consider
Red
very
May
briefly,
isn't removing
and
the
you're
people
welcome to
that are
ask me to
smearing me in
expand on
their
this,
chat, even though
very
it's
brief
not
sketches
related
of
to the
in-natura
discussion at
planning
all.
and the programmatic suggestions. of
Can't
the
help but
procedure.
notice that. It's
We
almost
see
like they
here,
apply
and
different rules to
I
different people.
regret sort of picking on the critique of the Gotha program here, having not been intended for publication. It's fragmentary, it's sketchy. So, grain of salt. I'm not trying to be too mean here, but we see in it, characterized as Marx admits by birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges.
And we can
only
all
a
thank
few
the
meaningful
walkaway
institutional
campaign
works
for
are
us
common.
spreading that particular
The
smear.
first
It was
is in
very
the
leftist of them.
The replacement of wages with labor vouchers, which does not help satisfy any of these above conditions.
Extraordinarily leftist
And
of
absent
them.
further clarification, can't be said to yet amount to anything more than a distributional reform, much in line with the awarding of Soviet employees dominate effectively these ceremonial non-marketized salaries. And more concerningly, Marx dictates the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as this is exchange of equal values. Content and form are changed because under the altered circumstances, no one can give anything except his labor, and because on the other hand, nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption. But as far as the distribution of the latter among the individual producers is concerned, the same principle prevails as in the exchange of commodity equivalents. A given amount of labor in one form is exchanged for equal amount of labor in another. In other words, we can confirm that our third condition is necessarily failed insofar as the judgments made on trade-offs in terms of need are necessarily disregarded in favor of those in terms of socially necessary labor time. There are arguments that Marx intended for these judgments to have been replaced with commensurating ratios of concrete labor time expended, but this suggestion is, as Marx notes, actually therein facially incoherent. As labor would cease to function as unit of measurement, more properly socially necessary labor time, we're not able to commensurate heterogeneous labors. The other 2 points, the other 2 big picture problems we have are unaddressed. Finally, I'll note that the relevant features of in natura planning for our purposes, as originated in Neurath and taken up by some recent literature, are that it plans in units and that it rejects the possibility of calculation between choices. So the former is promising for us. The latter poses somewhat of a problem, where we lack outright the possibility of calculation between choices, and we face these supposedly, small potatoes, low stakes decisions. We lack a means of putting into the form of trade-offs for the benefit of allocation for production, the goods for which political contestation is not a likely matter. And so in practice, when asked to make these trade-offs, advocates of in natura planning suggest either the use of these mathematical models, shadow prices, and thus
all we want is the Q&A. That's
as would have been made by value, or more simply, a few folks have suggested
I don't think we're asking too much, Cordelia. I really don't.
With the suggestion that relevant goods will be quoted, banned, and so on by the polity. But as I mentioned before, it's exactly the idea that occasional democratic political pressure on market values is inadequate that communists seek to critique in social democracy. This latter, less ambiguous institutional sketch of a market to be around the margins, rounded off by the democratic polity, is in fact not only realizable in the present day, but already realized. And so I'll conclude this paper with a highly abbreviated sketch of how to construct the sort of generalizable social judgments without markets. I suggest it's necessary to avoid lapsing back into market rationality as a means of deciding between these apparently inconsequential low-stakes trade-offs. The broader philosophical work necessary to establish this position is largely elsewhere, so I apologize for the curtness. Given the aforementioned resonances between production for need, production for use, and well-being, I seek here a capacious sketch of the basic object of consideration for this production for, that being something like need, use, well-being, the good, and so on. Need suggests hierarchies along the lines of the capacities approach. Use, which as I mentioned before, is actually used in Capital Volume 1 interchangeably with utility, is pretty flat-footed, without something like, the utilitarian's weird hedonism to fill it in. And something like well-being, welfare is profoundly multivalent in the philosophical literature. I think the sort of prosaic path here is to begin with a semantic analysis.
I don't know why I'm not high right now.
Which I suggest should be taken to mean the good for people.
Probably because my
and
vape
along
is
these
in the other
lines, living
room.
a good life. I will suggest that this is neither an objective nor subjective state, as taxonomy.
What schools are they teaching
theories of
need
well-being
science
usually
in?
run,
Is that a real
but in
thing?
fact, a judgment made against contextually variable standards
Man.
and sensitive to conditions, which the literature calls the shape of a life and so on. The fact of this judgment, how well my life is going for me, is neither objective nor universalizable, doesn't pose a substantive problem, as we wouldn't believe ourselves to be in a position to contest the veridicality of these judgments of this sort in any case. Nor, for our purposes, will the shifting and differing standards of these judgments pose an issue. Instead, we can look to something like the taxon law approach used to contest the calculation problem, and instead of attempting this iterative adjustment of policies on the basis of whether markets clear, we can attempt to iterate on judgments of how well, meaningfully.
Did they block you, Steve? You're one of theirs.
We can obtain information.
We've got them so tripped out that they're blocking their own people.
Of various provisional decisions and social institutions to this end, without attempting to do something like aggregate preferences or optimize social surplus, which effectively is where these aforementioned approaches get to. The provision decisions on which we would attempt to adjust would be along the lines of something like free provision of goods in general of this kind. Lotteries for this thing, like housing, this much in demand area, and so on. We're interested in the broad institution level arrangement.
I'm pretty sure she did, Gloria. That's a great call out.
And from this process of adjustment, alongside constant novel attempts by others to experiment with different ways of coordinating social behavior, we obtain a demand vector that approximates welfare by
always in with the unexpected comment, Beth.
If we have free provision of it, if there's a particular prerequisite for it to be obtained, if certain people need industrial stand mixers to open their bakeries and so on.
See?
And this ensures
I'm
the
not
concrete
blocking the socialists.
judgments
Why is
used
Red
in
Bay
trade-offs
blocking the
about
socialists?
production reflect something other than optimization of value or social surplus, while by design insulating most from the encroachment of optimization on social actions that would rather remain stubbornly non-optimal. And there we've just about wrapped up the paper.
Thank God.
I'll briefly talk a little bit more about what left out of that sketch before we move on to further questions. I don't have the YouTube questions in front of me. I'm probably going to open it up to folks in the Zoom for some questions first before we go look at those YouTube questions. Yeah, so fuller version of this is available on request, as is stuff like bibliography and so on. And effectively, that latter section is somewhat condensed because it gets a little technical.
Yeah.
And we've also left
Red
out
May
here,
should not have blocked Steve. Steve is a socialist. He's not even like
the kind of basic epistemic grounding that lets you set up something like these market rational judgments. Yeah, so I hope you all appreciated that. I'm very interested to hear comments, questions, and so on. As I said before, it's a little bit wacky because it's attempting to pose to this sort of big group audience of political theorists, philosophers, and so on. Ultimately, what I think is a pretty necessarily damning argument against markets. And I think it had pretty good results discursively in doing so. I was fairly happy with the number of would-be social democrats, left liberals, DSA, but nationalize the firm types who sort of came along with me here. And so I hope you were able to I'm happy to answer some more inside baseball marks questions to flesh out any of the sections that got short shrift here. And I also hope you were able to put yourself in the sort of broad group shoes here. Yeah, I'm excited to hear what folks have to say, what questions people have. Anyone in the Zoom chat? Let me see. Yes.
There are no questions in the Zoom either. That would be pretty
Please
hilarious.
go ahead. Can people unmute themselves, organizers?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just want to say terrific talk. It gets better every time.
This
I guess
person
I
has sat through
want
that talk
to
more than
ask you
once.
to
Holy
expand
shit.
on in terms of talking about the 3 market failures. I think the third one about externalities seems to be, like, to me, the most conclusive, most convincing kind of airtight argument for, you know, why
Exactly, Andrew.
this particular market failure necessarily leads to communist conclusions. But I guess I want, I mean, and this is also like kind of very minor points, but I would like you to expand a little bit on the first and second market failures, because so much of the argument seems to hinge upon saying, you know, even from the perspective of like a concerned social democrat or left liberal, the nature of commodity society necessarily precludes fulfilling these specific conditions. And so when you talk about, for example, the prospective petty bourgeois proprietor who goes to the bank with a business model that doesn't conform to market rationality, you know, the immediate objection that occurs to me is, for example, like artisanal production, you know, artisanal bakeries or
dangerous?
breweries.
Yes.
Oh, good. We're
I don't
seeing
know.
someone just like having a conversation with their family on a live stream on the internet. Well done, guys.
And
That was the most interesting thing that's happened in this whole presentation.
in terms of the second market failure, I'm not sure if you mentioned it in the talk, but in the paper, you sort of concede that you know, that kind of public provisioning would be possible with massive subsidies, right? And so to me, it seems to be like not so much a
Well, these are
possibility
communists. They
that's
don't like the
logically
DSA.
precluded by the nature or structure of commodity society, so much as like a question of political will, whether you can muster the political will to impose that kind of like massive provisioning of goods. And I think I'll leave it at those two for now, just in case anybody else has other questions.
Yeah, that's great. I think the first one in particular, I completely agree that it moved pretty briskly. And both times that I've given it, I wish that I expanded on the third a little further. I effectively want to say, I think the strong version of the argument at base level runs something like this. If we ask ourselves what it means for parties not on either side of a particular transaction, for not on either side of this contract to be meaningfully affected, what we wind up doing is we're put in the position, first of all, of attempting to stipulate what it is for these parties to be affected, why we ought to care about it, what it concretely means. And the handling of this tends to be really cursory, right? So usually, if you look at how this is treated by folks like the sort of mainstream
Autumn, in a socialist society, there would be no local bakery baking delicious
the answer would be,
because that would be
if we're
considered
interested in
private
talking,
property.
what does it mean to capture these externalities?
So that wouldn't exist. That's
what we
foolish.
tend to be interested in is something like, there are a suite of approaches, none of them particularly good, because they deal with a set of technical problems. But in general, they like to do something like hedonic regression. They like to look at something like, they try to figure out, they do things like look at changes in purchasing behavior. They do things, and also you get sometimes naive estimates of, ridiculous questions like, how much money would you pay to stop like a species from going extinct, right? You get sort of like undecidable questions like these expressed in dollar terms. Whether you work from like explicit demand for this going backwards into talking.
This isn't the real Socialism Saturday radical moderate. We're
Into
going to start
talking
that
utility functions, or whether you get something like attempting to infer this from changes in demand behavior. Neither of these really make a lot of sense. They make sense for certain limited cases, but in general, it's like a weird lacuna, right? There's not really an agreed upon means of doing this, because even among mainstream economists, because how we do this is going to be pretty heavily normatively laden. And there also isn't really agreement of what it means to handle the kind of downstream questions of how to take this impact and to do something like address how we discount this over time, right? How do I figure out, is this fish species being extinct for future generations? Does this matter less than it being extinct now? Should we care more about, the immiseration of future populations than present populations and so on? And the approaches to these are pretty unsatisfactory. They're pretty cursory. The second kind of big gap that you get looking at this works out to something like how it is that we actually handle these in a systemic sense, right? So you see treatment of this for really, really big stuff, like pollution, the case of the coal plant owner. But you don't really see it handled in a satisfactory way for smaller social decisions. It's not really clear how you do this for something like car parking, or something like the fact that a certain model of car might just be not the kind of thing we want to have around. Or
who makes that choice?
Running over children when it runs over them, actually hurting them. And there's certainly not an approach.
Isn't that the driver of the car, not the car itself?
Getting something meaningful out of this school of thought. When you come to cases where no market transaction is involved at any level, right? Where we have cases where two people doing something, that doing something not necessarily being a market transaction, is not money mediated, and they're doing something negatively affects a third party. And so as a sort of like, as a small example, right, of a case which you actually could bring up as like a non-money positive externalities case, which is, not something people discuss or think through. You could have something like the establishment, right, of like a local bowling club, right, is going to be a sort of positive externality social action. I'm having a good time, you're having a good time, and my having like brought into being this club, my having sort of created for you the possibility of going out and bowling collectively with other people is going to leave everyone better off. And so thinking about how you price something like this becomes really, really obscure. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially when the kind of decision that you're talking about is one that's not going to be mediated by markets or money to begin with. So both of these are sides of the equation where this kind of problematic really hasn't been taken seriously. So you hear people talk a lot about externalities, welfare economics, and so on. But you kind of get the sense that they don't really mean the conclusions that they're giving to you. The only thing that comes close to some sort of like basic agreement tends to be sort of big consensus stuff. Like, barring, of course, the sort of political, economic, institutional arrangements that would render this impossible, like 9 in 10 economists in something like the National Bureau of Economic Research do Chicago poll will say that they support something like a heavy carbon tax, right? Like $100 a ton to capture all the harm that carbon is doing. But when it comes to elaborating the small cases or elaborating why, the ball is really dropped here. And I think the reason the ball is dropped is pretty spooky. There's not actually a reason, conceptually or argumentatively, why you should limit the sort of scale at which you're concerned about this phenomenon. And there's also not a reason why you should be interested in limiting this to market-mediated transactions. And it's really not clear how you come across the information. All the stuff about the need of people, the good of those I live together with, is supposed to arrive at the sort of liberal policymaker here. And so the sketches you get are ad hoc, and they're stupid. They're quite empty. But effectively, so these two are sort of like gaps that motivate the remainder of the treatment. But the kind of the sort of big picture provocation that we're interested in saying,
the majority of the time, we know your own ideology and the logical end
like,
results of your ideology better than you do.
If you actually think
that's the problem,
every social action,
and that is why there has never been a successful socialist experiment, because you guys don't even understand the logical consequences of your own arguments.
Even something like a purchase, right? If I buy a pair of shoes, you can't buy that pair of shoes. And you're probably likely to have something like, even if it's a very infinitesimal, even if it's a very infinitesimal variation, some kind of change on something like the local price at which we're expected to enter into this you can enter into this kind of transaction. So if you can't exclude certain sorts of social actions in general, and there isn't good reason to think you can, and it seems as if you ought to be adjusting our basic decisions about how we come together to figure out something like the ratios of we're producing this, we're producing that, we're making available these kinds of apartments and these kinds of stand mixers for bakers. It seems like what you're saying is all of those decisions have to be mediated by some kind of process that we absolutely can't specify at this point, of figuring out the effect on the needs / use, etc., right, of everyone. And we've got to do so out across what is effectively going to turn into an infinite time horizon. We don't have good reason, actually, for saying that we ought to stop with just people in the here and now. And if you say, like, okay, how are we going to do this? The answer is you can't do this with prices or markets. What you just said is no commodity. You said no good. There should be no trade-off in production or consumption. That reflects the value optimal level. That reflects the sort of social surplus maximizing rate at which these trade-offs would make possible exchange. And that's pretty weird. That's pretty spooky. And so when you entertain that, you then have to start thinking systematically about biting the bullet on the remainder of points here. And conversely, right, if you accept something like the sort of like neo-Neuratian / what I call like Polanyian sketch here, something like linear algebra / markets are good enough for these boring sectors, right? The boring sectors of like car production or in-house production. Not that these actually are boring sectors. The question is, how are you delineating the ones that you think you ought to, I guess in their sketch, like vote on, set quotas on, ban, limit? There aren't actually persuasive grounds in which to do this. And it pretty quickly becomes, it seems as if what you just arrived on is punting this big sphere of social action to the way in which we currently have judgments in this sphere of social action without really giving us anything over what it is we can do today. And with a sort of like social democratic state in which, we as communists are definitively not interested. I think I sort of condensed your two questions into one question, because I think it's expanding on that big third general point that gets you to the smaller one. I hope that was somewhat helpful in recapitulating.
No, it was not
I
helpful
hope that made
at
the
all.
stakes a little bit clearer.
It
Was that
not
at all helpful?
No, it was not helpful at all.
Any follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating, the view of the world that's presupposed by mainstream economics and the whole notion of externalities. If you collected examples that are taught as to what externalities were, you know, the train is passing the field and the ash goes over there and sets the field on fire. You can always find a way to put a value on that in terms of money. You know, you get them all together. I bet you would find one that the examples were all fairly similar, and that there were a lot of things. Let's say, for example, the time domination that Pistone would find from going to work and having your circadian rhythms for many years tied up to what capital does. You know, there's no way to put an externality on that, at least in terms of mainstream economics. But I would also contend that externalities is such a mush category that you could probably make anything an externality if you reached out to do that. You know, the question I think also is if in fact political freedom is the reason, is the ability to revisit and almost pragmatically re-legislate something and make a different decision when something is working. It seems that decisions that are made by the mathematical models of mainstream economics are irrevocable. They always turn out the solution which is proved to be best. And therefore, legal structures which are doing cost-benefit analysis, which they now have to do in kind of any kind of legislation, will always come to the same conclusions. You know, and our notion of being on a train that we can't turn around when you're in capitalism sort of says that there's something wrong with the models of mainstream economics in terms of how they model the world, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that example you gave, circadian rhythms and postone, is really strong. And you can recapitulate that pretty quickly. So if you were to play devil's advocate here, the thing that the mainstream economists would want to say is something along the lines of, well, you know, you're expected to get some disutility from work. You're weighing the disutility from work because this disutility is supposed to be captured in.
You're not late,
you know, it's
Judy. I
supposed to
started an
capture something
impromptu
like
stream early. We're doing real
disruption of your
socialism
circadian
Saturday.
rhythm.
Please. This is like pre-gaming.
And so you're supposed to be weighing this when deciding what jobs you will and won't take. But, you know, as you say, this line of argument doesn't really work if all the work that you can take looks like this. And in fact, it does. It's not the case that we actually have labor markets that work such that you're able to, in all these cases, pick the slightly less social surplus reproducing optimal choice production process for some particular commodity, some particular service. That doesn't put you in the position of being really miserable all the time. It could just be that this is going to be that, unless in fact you can ensure that you have this like really infinite number of variegated along production technique, production processes for each good and service, you're not going to be able to ensure that this is actually taken into account. And the second point, yeah, externalities is much, anything can be an externality, 100%, 100%. We are interested in something like, as you say, like political freedom in terms of relitigating means, in terms of what works. You can identify this with something like, you know, conscious collective control. And the basic sort of problematic that guides us here is figuring out how to ensure that this conscious collective control is getting us to different judgments that do reflect what works, need, and so on, and actually gets us to people living different, better lives, not under the yoke of these abstract, dicta of value markets and so on. So yeah, I think those are both great questions.
I would add that just as a specific example, to go back to the financial crisis, it seems that the Swedes, when they had their crisis in the 90s, essentially took over all the banking firms and got rid of all the bad assets in them, made them viable to a certain degree, and then sold them back to the private sector. That is an option that wasn't available to us because it's legally foreclosed the way it's set up in the Constitution and all the other blockages that are set around it. In other words, we're not capable of taking what might be even under a Keynesian or a heterodox economic version of capitalism that might be the best, the most viable for some sort of workable capitalism for a while. You can't do that. You're kind of hemmed in. There are decisions that you can't make the way it's particularly set up.
Absolutely. Anyone else in the Zoom? I might start to answer some of these questions from the YouTube chat. Marwan, yes, what's up?
Hey, amazing talk. Thank you. I was just wondering if you could expand on the alternatives to the aggregation of individual preferences as a mean for social decision, and also maybe reassure the average liberal that would be worried about the threats that this could pose for good old-fashioned democratic values and just institutional arrangements that we could come up with, like we could think of.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to get the chance to expand on that a bit. So first of all, the difference between this and something like what people call preference aggregation. This is sort of what I say is the philosophical machinery that gets left out of the background of this. I effectively propose that the categories of need, use, and so on aren't really filled in. And I suggest that even though Marx, clearly can't actually mean this, you see need, especially after you drop the sort of prima facie, like moral significance of the natural, unnatural need distinction, and use, which he uses interchangeably with utility in volume 1 of Capital, kind of strangely, and something like well-being or the good, are all basically driving at something. They're driving at something which is supposed to represent the thing in which we're generically interested, that we want to bring about in the lives of people, that they in our social actions in general. But the specific way in which we fill in this sketch is pretty underdetermined. And I'm really not happy with the sketches you get of what fill this in. Either the one, you couldn't really pull one out of Marx because he doesn't actually give a particularly elaborate account of needs.
There's no one that's going to disrupt the presentation, regardless of
and
what
when you
the
see people
socialist
take up
is
needs,
lying in their
they
chat
usually just want to
saying.
talk about primary goods.
I also don't have the link to the Zoom call.
But yeah, so I
So
want to
again,
talk about
socialists in the chat
how to fill in this
blatantly
content
making
in a
things
way
up
which is
to lie
going
and
to get us to
smear,
something
because that's
which
all
is a bit
socialists know
less
how to do.
paternalistic, which doesn't
I wasn't even
propose
going to
something
stream this
like
today. It wasn't even
the
the
sort
plan.
of like contentious, hedonistic proposition that the utilitarian would avow, right? That being that we're going to be value monists about something like an objective state of pleasure. This objective state of pleasure is the good, or the kind of contentious thesis of something like the more preference-oriented, like preference aggregating post-Sidgwick tradition, which is interested in postulating something like ipso facto, if you getting your preferences is the good, right? So I think we have good reason not to be happy with either of these. We don't really like the consequences. It seems awfully contentious to say that some objective state of pleasure, as might be measured, on something like an fMRI. Obviously, Bentham did not know about fMRIs, but he would have been an eliminative materialist. Sorry, if he had known about this stuff. He was real into the natural in this way. We're not going to be happy.
Isn't it
with
amazing
like
how many times we've caught
that
socialists lying just
you
by
getting
watching
your
their
preference,
chat?
you express a preference for something like chocolate and some lower preference for something like cake, and you're getting this thing ipso facto correlate. The difference between this expressed or revealed preference is going to equate to the difference in the good for you in general. I also think we have reason not to be happy with the sort of Aristotelian picture we can use to fill in this account of the good here. Something like the good for people is what allows them to do the thing which is supposed to be good, the sort of activity we take to be coextensive with the good. The activity that is eudaimonia, right? I think it's pretty contentious also to say the good for people is this kind of activity, oriented towards conditions, oriented towards perfection, under conditions of autarkeia, and like identify this with a good simpliciter. People have sort of real qualms, right? What about, things like my having glasses? What about cases where my ability to perform this kind of sort of perfection-oriented activity conflict or have trade-offs with your ability to perform that sort of, eudaimonic activity, right? What do we do in those cases? And they are going to conflict, because the things that it takes for you to do something like your baking, if this is going to be it for you, and the things it takes for you to do something like be a jeweler who splits diamonds are going to wildly vary in terms of what they require. We're probably not going to actually be able to say that we can be, we're not actually going to be able to be impartial on these. We're going to have to come to form trade-offs about them through some kind of weighing them. And the other issue is, there's a sort of tension between this, the sort of, vision of the good as this kind of activity that happens under conditions of free association, and the whole need stuff that we were interested in a second ago, and the sort of sleight of hand that you can perform to get out of this tension is to say something like, we're interested in need insofar as they make this kind of activity possible, but I don't think most people are actually happy to bite that bullet. I think there are a lot of needs for things which are not actually prerequisites for this specific kind of activity, but which we have a pressing interest in. It's, classically paternalistic. And so to sort of wriggle our way out of that, what I think we ought to look to, and I do this elsewhere, is to talk about the good as like the good for people as a kind of judgment. And specifically, I know Philip said, read the values judgments pun. He was like, well, is this going to be Kantian? I can do a little bit of a Kant riff here. Effectively, what it would be is something like analogous to a judgment of taste, right? And that it's not going to be universalizable. It's not going to be veridical. What effectively this is saying is, what we're interested in, if we're interested in the good for people we live with, right? Who we together constitute a society
Why
with.
do I have an
We're interested
obligation
in
to be
your
concerned about the
judgment
other
of how
people
your
that I
life
live
is
with?
going.
Like in
and
the
your
community.
judgment of your life. You know,
I don't think I
I'm
do.
living a good, meaningful, and fulfilling life. I'm living a life which is deficient in these ways because I don't get to do X, or because, you know, this thing about my life is very bad. So I think these judgments are for sort of basically like epistemological reasons, the kind of thing which we should be interested in morally. And for obvious reasons, these judgments don't actually coincide in this sort of like forward-looking prudential value way with you getting what you want, right? So it might be the case that if you get something that you said you wanted, your life will be better in this way, right? But we can't actually stipulate in the way in which the sort of preference aggregators would want that these judgments that you're doing so will always lead you to have your judgment of how good your life is, how meaningful it is, and so on, be affected in this way. We can't actually promise that looking forward. It might be the case, it might coincide, but we don't want to postulate that it is. That seems really unrealistic. Also, asking people about preferences is silly. No one really thinks you can do it anymore. This is why everyone's on this sort of revealed preference wave. It makes the formal side of this really hard. It's basically, and again, you wind up with like pretty pressing forward-looking issues. And I know we've discussed a lot of this before, vis-a-vis like time preference and so on. But basically, what it's saying is we should be interested in this judgment. Your judgment might be against standards, but the standards of your judgment for what constitute a good life are going to be variable. They're going to change, and that's completely fine. We're not going to, you know, write you up for having had imperfect information, right? When your standard for, when you realize, you know, I got to this point in my life and my life is good, or I tried this and it made me really happy. So the baseline issues between these are going to be like at the sort of conceptual epistemic level. Vis-a-vis democracy, this is basically the question of like how democracy fits onto the market, right? What we're looking for here is a way to be sure that we can enter the same kinds of like small atomic aggregating social decisions for which we presently use markets as a kind of social technology for judgment, without making the same kinds of decisions which would result from having used values judgments, right? We want our own judgments. Judgment that don't coincide with the weights or payoffs that markets would give us. And so what we want is something that we can take that seems significantly more transparent, accountable, revisable, open to quite dramatic heterogeneity in ways of life, that we can take into these sorts of granular, concrete decisions without necessarily sorry, something in the chat made me laugh. Without necessarily winding up making the same decisions you would have otherwise. But this is not the same as saying like, we've got to be, we're sending you off to the maximizing minds, right? There are no maximizing minds, because when you construe things this way, you actually can't work forwards in terms of maximizing the relative production of this good, and that good. What it is instead is backwards looking. What it's looking at is changes in something like good that stem from changes in institutional arrangements, moving from, for instance, well, you know, having this wide set of things being free, to having this set of things being quoted, to having this set of things tied maybe in cases of scarcity to sort of this or that social desideratum. But the point is we ought to be able to judge in this sort of backwards looking way on these, rather than on the individual commodities in this forward looking preference aggregating way. Again, also an exhaustive answer. Sorry for the length of that. Both of these questions were great because they gave me space to expand
He's
on
still
stuff.
talking. We're about to wrap up though, don't worry.
Not that I did so good at on time.
Yeah.
As a couple chat commentators have reminded me.
I mean, my God.
Roxana?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cordelia.
All right,
So
guys.
my question is basically around
I
the
am sorry. I know. I really thought that this was going to be better. I really did. I am so sorry to make you sit through that for 2 hours, but I have good news. Because in 5 minutes, we are starting our actual, real Socialism Saturday. That was but a pregame, okay? And I really, really think that our actual Socialism Saturday is going to be much better. This was what we just watched was the most long-winded socialism stream. I really thought we were going to get a golden nugget. There was nothing. There was nothing. That was the biggest waste of time socialism stream that I have ever seen. I am so sorry. I thought it was going to be better. Red May has never let me down like this before. I just have no idea what to say. You know, it was live. What can you do? You can't always, it just works out that way. But we are not watching Red May for actual Socialism Saturday, which is going to start in 4 minutes. And what we are going to do, and you should be redirected as soon as this stream ends to the actual Socialism Saturday stream. We are going to be taking a 3-part course on how to be a good comrade. This is going to be great. Yes, Laura, I need a drink as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this stream now. I'm going to run downstairs. I'm going to get my beer that is left over from yesterday. And then we're going to have actual socialism. And I think this is going to be much better. I'm so sorry, guys. I am so sorry. But like, you know what? If you sat through that, you can sit through anything. I promise. All right, guys, head over to Real Socialism Saturday. Thank you, Dragon Water, for the super chat. I really do appreciate it. And let's learn how to be the very best comrade we can be. We'll see you soon, guys.